"You're too big for this bed," she blushed. Mafia boss pulled her close. "Then we'll break it together." The fluorescent lights of Greybridge General Hospital hummed with a low, headache-inducing vibration that seemed to burrow straight into the base of Tessa Hale's skull. It was 3 a.m, and the rest of the world was asleep, wrapped in the comfort of darkness and silence. But here, in the sterile white hallways that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, the night was just another shift that refused to end. Tessa rubbed the back of her neck, her fingers catching on the loose strands of blonde hair that had escaped her messy bun hours ago. Her feet throbbed inside her sensible nursing shoes, a dull ache that radiated up her calves. She had officially clocked out 40 minutes ago, yet she was still standing in the doorway of room 314, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Mrs. Gable's chest. The elderly woman had been admitted with palpitations and severe anxiety, convinced that the storm brewing outside was a harbinger of doom. While other nurses had efficiently checked her vitals and moved on, Tessa had stayed. She had sat by the bedside, holding a hand that felt as fragile as parchment paper, listening to stories about a husband who had passed away 10 years ago. It was Tessa's greatest weakness, at least according to her supervisor. She cared too much. She let the lives of strangers bleed into her own until she was empty, pouring from a cup that never seemed to get refilled. "Go home, Tessa," she told herself, finally stepping away from the doorframe. "You are exhausted." She gathered her coat from the break room, wrapping the thick wool tightly around her frame. The weather report had promised rain, and the drumming against the hospital windows confirmed that the skies over Greybridge had opened up. She pushed through the double doors of the employee exit, gasping as the cold, damp air hit her face. It was a shock to the system, stripping away the sterile warmth of the hospital and replacing it with the gritty, metallic scent of the city. Her apartment was a 30-minute bus ride away, but the stop was 3 blocks over. To save time, she usually cut through the narrow alleyway behind the old textile factories. It was a shortcut she knew she should not take at this hour, but the promise of her bed and the heavy weight of fatigue made her reckless. Tessa ducked her head against the driving rain, her boots splashing through puddles that reflected the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps. The alley was a canyon of brick and shadow, usually silent except for the scuttling of rats or the distant wail of sirens. Tonight, however, the air felt different. It was heavy, charged with a strange static that made the hair on her arms stand up beneath her coat. She turned the corner near the loading docks and froze. The scene before her looked like a frame from a nightmare, illuminated by the flickering light of a broken neon sign buzzing overhead. 2 sleek, expensive black sedans sat at odd angles, their windows shattered into diamonds of glass that littered the wet asphalt. The metal doors were riddled with holes, the unmistakable scars of high-caliber gunfire. Tessa stopped breathing. Her first instinct was to turn and run, to sprint back to the safety of the main road and call the police. But then she saw the bodies. 3 men lay motionless on the ground, dark pools spreading rapidly beneath them to mix with the rainwater. And then she saw him. A 4th man was slumped against the brick wall of the factory, hidden deep in the shadows between a dumpster and the rear bumper of the lead sedan. He was not moving, but as a jagged bolt of lightning tore across the sky, she saw his chest heave. It was a wet, ragged breath, the sound of a lung struggling for air. Panic clawed at Tessa's throat, urging her to flee. This was gang violence. This was the dark underbelly of Greybridge that the news warned about, the world of organized crime that swallowed people whole. If she stayed, she could be next, but the nurse in her overruled the coward. Someone was dying. Before her brain could fully process the danger, her legs were moving. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees on the wet pavement beside the surviving man. Up close, the damage was terrifying. He was dressed in a suit that likely cost more than her entire year's salary, the fabric now ruined by mud and blood. She reached out, her hands shaking only until they touched him. Then, the training took over. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice sharp and professional despite the chaos. There was no answer. his head lulled forward, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. Tessa quickly scanned him for injuries. There was a gunshot wound to his left shoulder, bleeding heavily, and another graze along his ribs. The shoulder wound was the priority. The arterial flow was strong, pulsing in time with his fading heartbeat. She didn't have her kit. She didn't have gauze. Tessa ripped the scarf from her neck. It was a thick, knitted thing her grandmother had made, and without hesitation, she wound it tightly around his upper arm, high above the wound, creating a makeshift tourniquet. She grabbed a discarded pen from her pocket, twisting it into the fabric to tighten the pressure until the bright red flow slowed to a sluggish ooze. "Stay with me," she commanded, pressing her gloved hands directly over the wound to apply pressure. "Come on." The man let out a low groan, a sound of guttural pain that seemed to vibrate through the pavement. His head snapped up. Tessa found herself locked in a gaze so intense it nearly knocked the wind out of her. His eyes were dark, almost black in the shadows, but they burned with a terrifying clarity. He was not unconscious. He was watching her. There was no gratitude in that look, only a predator's assessment. He was in shock, losing blood and surrounded by death, yet the sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "I am a nurse," Tessa said, leaning her weight into her hands to keep the pressure firm. "You have lost a lot of blood. Do not try to move." He did not listen. With a surge of strength that should have been impossible for a man in his condition, his right hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. His grip was like iron, bruising her skin even through the sleeve of her coat. He pulled her slightly closer, his eyes searching her face, cataloging every detail, the fear in her wide blue eyes, the water dripping from her nose, the steady, competent way her hands held his life together. "You are too calm for a civilian," he murmured. The air between them seemed to vanish, leaving only a charged stillness that defied the storm around them. Tessa felt a shiver race down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "I am not calm," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am terrified." His lips quirked upward in a faint ghost of a smile. But before he could speak again, the roar of engines cut through the rain. Tessa jerked her head up. Tires shrieked against the wet asphalt as a third black car drifted around the corner, headlights blinding her. It screeched to a halt mere feet from where they knelt. The doors flew open before the wheels had even stopped turning. 4 men poured out, weapons drawn. These were not police officers. They held military-grade rifles, their movements precise and lethal. "Get away from him!" one of them roared. Tessa scrambled back, her hands raising instinctively in surrender. But the man on the ground did not let go of her wrist. He kept her tethered to him, an anchor in the storm. "Don't shoot," Tessa screamed, her voice cracking. "I am helping him." The lead gunman, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running through his eyebrow, leveled his weapon at Tessa's chest. His face was a mask of fury and panic. "Boss!" the man shouted, rushing forward but keeping the gun trained on Tessa. "Did she do this?" "No." The man on the ground gritted out. The authority in that single word was absolute. Despite his injuries, despite lying in the mud, he commanded the space. The gunmen hesitated, lowering their weapons by a fraction of an inch. "She stopped the bleeding," the injured man said, his breathing becoming shallower. "Marco, get the car." Marco, the scarred man, holstered his weapon and knelt beside his boss, his eyes darting suspiciously to Tessa. "We need to get you to the doctor. Now." The leak must have come from the inner circle. "We are exposed here." He looked at Tessa with cold, calculating eyes. "She is a liability. Damien, she has seen your face. She has seen the bodies. We cannot leave loose ends." Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what loose ends meant in movies. She tried to pull her wrist free, panic surging, but the man, Damien, held fast. "She saved my life." Damien said, His voice was growing weaker, but the steel edge remained. "Nobody touches her. That is an order. But she is a witness," Marco argued, reaching under Damien's arm to hoist him up. "The police will be here in 3 minutes. If they find her, they will question her. She will talk. Then she comes with us." Damien decided, "What?" Tessa gasped, pulling harder now. "No, I am not going anywhere with you. I saved you. Just let me go." Damien was hauled to his feet by Marco and another guard. He swayed, his face losing the last of its color, but his eyes locked onto hers again. He looked at the smear of his own bright red blood on her pale cheek, a stark contrast to her fair skin. "You cannot stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If the people who did this come back to check their work, they will kill you just for being here. Get her in the car. I have a shift tomorrow," Tessa protested hysterically, a ridiculous thing to say in the face of a kidnapping. But her mind was grasping for normalcy. "Get her," Damien repeated, his head lolling back as consciousness finally began to slip. Before Tessa could run, two of the guards grabbed her arms. They were not rough, but they were firm, marching her toward the waiting vehicle. She struggled, digging her heels into the wet pavement, but it was useless against their strength. They shoved her into the back seat of the leather interior sedan, right next to the bleeding crime lord. The door slammed shut, sealing her in. The lock clicked with a terrifying finality. "Drive," Marco ordered from the front seat. The car surged forward, pinning Tessa against the seat. Beside her, Damien Vascari. The name floated up from the depths of her memory, from newspaper headlines she usually ignored, slumped against the window. His breathing was wet and heavy. Tessa huddled against the opposite door, hugging her knees. She watched the city lights blur past, distorted by the rain on the tinted glass. She was not going home. She was not going to sleep. She had just been swept into the orbit of the most dangerous man in Greybridge, and she had no idea if she would survive the night. The drive was a blur of adrenaline and fear. They bypassed the city center, heading toward the wealthy hills that overlook the smog and grime of the lower districts. The car wound up a private road, passing through heavy iron gates that swung open silently to admit them. The Vascari safe house was not a house. It was a fortress disguised as a modern mansion. Concrete and glass rose from the cliffside, stark and imposing. As the car stopped, the doors were thrown open. The men moved with practiced efficiency. Damien was lifted out and carried inside. Tessa was pulled out after him, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. "Bring her to the main hall," Marco barked at a guard. "Watch her. Do not let her use a phone." Tessa was led into a cavernous living room that looked more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights below, a beautiful, glittering lie that hid the violence she had just witnessed. The furniture was black leather and chrome, cold and uninviting. She stood in the center of the room, dripping wet, her nurse's scrubs stained with mud and the blood of a mafia boss. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently. In the center of the room, chaos reigned. A man carrying a medical bag, Damien's personal doctor, was already cutting away the ruined suit jacket. Damien sat on the edge of a leather sofa, his shirt stripped off, revealing a torso defined by hard muscle and old scars. Tessa watched, unable to look away, as the doctor worked. He cleaned the wound, injecting a local anesthetic before beginning to stitch the torn flesh. Damien barely flinched. He sat with a stoic rigidity, his jaw clenched, his eyes closed as he focused on controlling the pain. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes where Tessa stood guarded by a silent sentinel near the door, her mind racing with escape plans that all ended in failure. When the doctor finished, he bandaged the shoulder and stepped back, wiping his hands. "You were lucky, Damien. Another inch to the right and it would have hit the artery. You need rest, no exertion." Damien nodded once. Opening his eyes, he tested the movement of his arm, grimacing slightly, then looked across the room. "Leave us," he commanded. The doctor hesitated, packing his bag. The guards looked at each other. "Everyone," Damien said, his voice quiet but echoing in the large space. Marco looked like he wanted to protest, glaring at Tessa as if she were a bomb waiting to detonate, but he nodded and signaled the others. The room emptied, leaving Tessa alone with the wolf she had saved. The silence that stretched between them was thick enough to choke on. Tessa's fear began to curdle into anger. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and furious. "You kidnapped me," she said. Her voice shook, but she lifted her chin, refusing to cower. Damien reached for a glass of amber liquid on the table beside him. He took a slow sip, the crystal glass looking delicate in his large hand. He did not look like a monster now. He looked like a weary man carrying the weight of the world on his injured shoulders. "I protected you," he corrected. "Protected me?" Tessa let out a sharp, disbelief-filled laugh. "You dragged me into a car against my will. You have men with guns standing outside that door. That is not protection. That is a crime." Damien set the glass down. He stood up slowly, favoring his left side. He was tall, looming over her even from across the room. He wore only his suit trousers, his chest bare and bandaged. "If I had left you there, Viktor Kostov's men would have circled back. They would have found a witness. They would have killed you and dumped your body in the river. Is that the freedom you wanted?" Tessa fell silent. The name meant nothing to her, but the truth in his voice was chilling. "I want to go home," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "You will," Damien said, "when I am sure it is safe." He walked toward her. Tessa flinched, stepping back, but he did not stop until he was standing directly in front of her. He smelled of rain, expensive scotch, and the metallic tang of iodine. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the tremor in her hands. He saw the exhaustion etched under her eyes, the smear of dirt on her chin. Most people crumbled in his presence. Most people begged or cried. She was standing there, furious and terrified, demanding answers. It intrigued him more than anything had in years. "Thank you," he said softly. The words caught Tessa off guard. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "For what?" "For saving my life," he answered. "You could have run. You should have run, but you stayed. I am a nurse." She deflected, her breath hitching as he took another half-step closer. "It is what I do." Damien reached out to a side table and picked up a clean, white towel. He held it out, but instead of handing it to her, he raised his hand toward her face. Tessa froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. She watched his hand approach, expecting violence, expecting a threat. Instead, his fingers were gentle. He used the corner of the towel to wipe the dried smear of blood from her cheekbone. The motion was slow, deliberate. His knuckles brushed against her skin, warm and rough. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to Tessa's stomach. It was a physical reaction so strong it made her knees weak. She stared up at him, her lips slightly parted, unable to look away from the intensity of his gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. The danger of the night, the guns, the politics, it all faded into the background, leaving only the heat of his body near hers and the sensation of his hand lingering near her face. "You have blood on you," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "My blood." Tessa swallowed hard, her throat dry. I can wash it off." Damien lowered the towel, but he didn't step back. His eyes dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "Go to the guest room," he said, his voice rougher now. "Get some sleep. Tessa. We will figure out the rest in the morning." He knew her name. She hadn't told him her name. Tessa nodded, too overwhelmed to ask how he knew. She turned and walked toward the door he indicated, feeling his gaze burning into her back with every step. She had saved a life tonight, but as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, she had the sinking feeling that she had just lost ownership of her own. Tessa woke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs before her eyes even opened. For a disorienting second, she expected to see the water-stained ceiling of her cramped apartment and hear the familiar rumble of the morning bus passing by her window. Instead, she stared up at pristine crown molding and a modern chandelier that looked like a cluster of captured stars. The events of the previous night crashed back into her memory with the force of a physical blow, the rain, the blood, the man with eyes darker than the storm. She sat up abruptly, realizing she was in a bed that was larger than her entire kitchen. The sheets were gray silk, cool against her skin, and the room smelled of cedar and rain. She was still wearing her scrubs, which had been washed and dried while she slept, folded neatly on a chair nearby. The efficiency of it made her skin crawl. It felt less like hospitality and more like processing. Tessa dressed quickly, her hands shaking as she tied her shoelaces. Anger began to replace the fear. She was not a guest. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage. She stormed out of the bedroom and followed the scent of coffee down a long, minimalist hallway. It led her back to the open-concept living area where she had arrived the night before. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a gray, weeping sky over Graybridge. The city looking small and helpless from this height, Damien Vescari was sitting at a glass dining table, reading a newspaper. He looked infuriatingly composed. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt, the top collar unbuttoned, his left arm immobilized in a black sling. There was no sign of the man who had been bleeding out in an alleyway hours ago. He looked untouchable. "Good morning," he said without looking up, turning a page of the paper. There is coffee on the sideboard. Tessa marched up to the table. Ignoring the coffee, "I am leaving," she announced, her voice sharp. Damien folded the newspaper slowly and placed it on the table. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Sit down, Tessa. Eat something. I do not want to eat," she snapped, gripping the back of a leather chair until her knuckles turned white. "I want to go home. I have a life. I have a job that I am already late for. You cannot just keep me here because it is convenient for you. This is insane. It is not convenience," Damien replied calmly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the table. "It is necessity." He gestured to the chair opposite him. When she did not move, he sighed, a sound of weary patience. "Victor Kostov knows someone helped me. His men are sweeping the area. If you go back to your apartment now, you might as well paint a target on your back." Tessa scoffed, though the confidence in her voice wavered. "I am nobody. They do not know who I am." The sound of footsteps approaching made her turn. A younger man with glasses and a tablet tucked under his arm walked into the room. He looked like a college student, starkly out of place among the grim-faced guards standing by the doors. "Show her," Damien ordered. The young man, who Damien introduced simply as his tech specialist, tapped the screen of his tablet and slid it across the glass table toward Tessa. She looked down, expecting to see news footage of the shootout. Instead, the screen showed a grainy black-and-white video. It was night. A figure was walking down a sidewalk Tessa recognized immediately. It was the route she took from the hospital to the bus stop. "That is me," she whispered. "Keep watching," the tech specialist said quietly. In the video, Tessa turned a corner. A few seconds later, another figure appeared, a man, dressed in dark clothing with his hood up and a face covering obscuring his features, walked into the frame. He stopped where she had turned, looked around, and then followed. The timestamp was from 4 days ago. Tessa felt the blood drain from her face. She backed away from the table, her legs suddenly feeling like they were made of water. "He was following me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why? I hadn't done anything. I didn't know you then." Damien stood up, wincing slightly as the movement pulled on his injured shoulder. He walked around the table until he stood in front of her, blocking the view of the terrifying footage. "Kostov has been looking for leverage against the hospital board to move narcotics through their supply chain," Damien explained, his tone devoid of pity but heavy with seriousness. Or perhaps he was just scouting for civilians to use as pawns. "It does not matter why. The point is, you were already on their radar. Now that you have saved me, you are a priority." Tessa wrapped her arms around herself, a chill settling deep in her bones that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The threat had been abstract before, a movie plot she had stumbled into. Now, seeing that masked figure stalking her in the dark, it felt violently real. "So I am trapped," she said, looking up at him. She hated the tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She refused to let them fall. Damien watched her, noting the way her chin lifted in defiance despite her fear. Most people would be hysterical. Tessa was angry. He liked that about her. It suggested a spine of steel beneath the soft exterior. "You are safe," he corrected, "and you are not a prisoner. I just need time to neutralize the threat." He gestured toward the expansive hallway. "Come. You should know the layout of the house. If you're going to stay, I do not want you feeling like a caged animal." Tessa hesitated, then nodded. She had no other choice. Damien led her through the penthouse. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, cold and impressive. He showed her the library, the gym, and the media room. But Tessa barely registered the luxury. She was too busy watching him. He moved with a predatory grace, checking corners and windows instinctively, a constant reminder of the violence that dictated his life. They ended up in the kitchen, a sleek space of stainless steel and black marble. The storm outside had intensified, the sky turning a bruised purple as thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. "I can make tea," Damien offered, moving toward the kettle. It was such a mundane domestic offer coming from a crime lord that Tessa almost laughed. Before she could answer, a massive crack of thunder shook the building. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging the windowless kitchen into heavy gloom. Tessa gasped, the darkness triggering the memory of the alleyway. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand finding Damien's forearm. She gripped him hard, her fingers digging into his skin. "I have you." His voice came from the dark, deep and steady. Warmth enveloped her hand. Damien had covered her fingers with his own. His palm was calloused, his skin radiating a heat that seeped into her cold hand. He did not pull away. He did not mock her fear. He simply stood there, a solid anchor in the shifting dark. The emergency generator kicked in with a low hum, and the lights flickered back on. Tessa looked down at their joined hands. Her pale fingers were stark against his tan skin, trapped beneath his large palm. The intimacy of it was shocking. She snatched her hand back as if she had been burned, her heart doing a traitorous flip in her chest. "Sorry," she muttered, looking away. Damien let his hand drop to his side, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on her flushed face. "It is fine. The grid in this city is as corrupt as its politicians." He walked past her toward the glass doors that led to the balcony. "I need fresh air." Tessa followed him, drawn by a curiosity she could not suppress. The balcony was sheltered by an overhang, protecting them from the driving rain. The wind whipped at Damien's shirt, plastering the fabric to his chest, emphasizing the bandages beneath. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the city that looked like a gray smudge through the downpour. "Why are they doing this?" Tessa asked, stepping up beside him but keeping a safe distance. "This war. Why now?" Damien took a breath, the cold air seeming to center him. "Kostov wants the port. He wants to move product that I do not allow in my territory. We had a truce, a fragile one." He decided that ambition was worth more than his word. He turned his head to look at her. His profile was sharp, cut from granite, but there were lines of exhaustion around his eyes that the dim light could not hide. "I thought I could keep the peace," he admitted, his voice low. "I thought I could keep the violence contained to the shadows. I was wrong, and now innocent people like you are getting pulled into the crossfire." Tessa studied him. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to see him as the villain. But standing there, listening to the regret in his voice, she saw something else. She saw a man carrying a burden so heavy it was crushing him, a man who was trying to hold back a tide of chaos with his bare hands. "You are not a monster," she said, the words slipping out before she could check them. Damien looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "Do not be so sure. Tessa, you have only seen me on my best behavior." Before Tessa could respond, the air shattered. The sound was not thunder. It was the distinct, high-pitched crack of automatic gunfire. "Get down!" Damien roared. The glass door behind them exploded inward, showering the kitchen with shards. Bullets chipped the stone railing, sending dust and debris flying into the air. Tessa stood frozen, her mind unable to process the violence. Damien moved. He did not run for cover, he lunged for her. His good arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet as he tackled her to the ground behind the heavy stone planter box. He slammed her down onto the concrete floor of the balcony, covering her body with his own. He was heavy, a solid wall of muscle and heat pressing her into the ground. "Stay down," he hissed against her ear. More shots rang out, bullets whining through the air where they had been standing seconds ago. The noise was deafening. a chaotic symphony of destruction. Glass shattered, metal pinged, and the roar of a car engine revving echoed from the street below. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clutching at Damien's shirt. She could feel his heart pounding against her chest, a rapid, powerful rhythm that matched her own. He was shielding her completely. If a bullet found them, it would hit him first. He was using his own body as a human shield for a woman he had met less than 24 hours ago. Strange. Terrified thoughts raced through her mind. The concrete was cold against her back, but he was burning hot. She could smell the soap on his skin, mixed with the sharp scent of ozone and cordite, in the middle of an assassination attempt, pinned beneath a mafia boss. Tessa realized with a jolt that she felt safer right now than she had in her empty apartment. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. Tires screeched, fading into the distance. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the sound of the rain and their harsh, ragged breathing. Damien did not move immediately. He stayed over her, his head turned toward the street, listening. "Are they gone?" Tessa whispered, her voice trembling. Damien looked down at her. His face was inches from hers. The adrenaline had dilated his pupils until his eyes were entirely black. "Yes," he rasped. He shifted his weight, wincing as he pushed himself up onto his knees, but he kept his body positioned between her and the open street. His hands moved over her fast, checking for injuries. His palms swept down her arms, over her shoulders, feeling for blood or broken bones. "Are you hit? Tell me?" "No," Tessa gasped, sitting up. "I am okay. Are you? Your shoulder." Damien ignored his injury. He stared at her, his chest heaving. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a stray lock of hair that had fallen across her eyes. "You are okay," he murmured, as if reassuring himself. His gaze dropped to her mouth. The air between them crackled, charged with a tension that was suddenly, confusingly electric. The violence had stripped away everything else, leaving only the raw, primal fact that they were alive. Damien's thumb grazed the corner of her lower lip. It was a tender, impulsive gesture, completely at odds with the violence that surrounded them. For a heartbeat. Tessa thought he was going to kiss her. She found herself leaning in, just a fraction of an inch, her breath catching in her throat. The sound of shouting from inside the apartment broke the spell. Damien's guards were rushing into the room, calling his name. Tessa jerked back. Scrambling to her feet, her face burned, her heart felt like it was going to beat right out of her chest. "I can't do this," she said, her voice rising in panic. She backed away from him, shaking her head. "Bullets flying through windows? People trying to kill us? I am a nurse. Damien, I save lives. I don't get shot at." Damien stood up slowly. His face hardened, the mask of the dawn slipping back into place, but his eyes remained turbulent. "Tessa." "No," she interrupted, hysteria edging into her tone. "I cannot stay here. It is not safe. You said this was a safe house, but it is a war zone. I want to leave. Now?" Damien looked at the shattered glass door, then back at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the resolve. He knew that if he forced her to stay now, he would break her spirit, and he found that he respected her too much to do that. "Fine," he said, the word heavy with reluctance. "Marco," he shouted over his shoulder as his lieutenant burst onto the balcony. "Gun drawn, clear the perimeter. And get a car ready." "You are letting her go?" Marco asked, looking at the destruction in disbelief. "Boss, it is suicide. She's not staying here to be target practice," Damien snarled. He turned back to Tessa. "You can go home, but you do not go anywhere alone. 2 of my men will be outside your apartment building 24 hours a day. Another will follow you to the hospital." Tessa opened her mouth to argue. "Do not," Damien cut her off, his voice hard. "That is the condition. You take the protection or you stay in this house. Choose." Tessa looked at him. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He was terrified for her. She realized the control was just a way to manage the fear. "Fine," she whispered. "I will take the detail." Damien nodded once. "Go, before I change my mind." As Tessa walked away, Stepping over the broken glass, she felt his eyes on her back. It felt like a physical weight. She was leaving the line of fire, but as she walked out of the penthouse and into the elevator, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake. She was running away from the danger. Yes, but she was also running away from the only man who had ever looked at her and seen someone worth burning the world down to save. The silence in Tessa Hale's apartment was not peaceful. It was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like the pressure before a storm. In the 3 days since she had left the Vescari safe house, she had tried to stitch the torn edges of her life back together, but the fabric no longer fit. She threw herself into double shifts at Greybridge General, moving through the trauma ward with a mechanical efficiency that worried her colleagues. She changed IV bags, monitored vitals, and offered soothing words to patients, but her mind was always elsewhere. She found herself jumping at the sound of a dropped clipboard. The screech of ambulance tires made her heart slam against her ribs, her body bracing for gunfire that wasn't there. "You look like you are haunting this place." Sarah, one of the day shift nurses, commented gently near the nurses' station. "Go home, Tessa. Sleep." But sleep was the enemy. Every time Tessa closed her eyes, she saw the rain-slicked alley. She felt the phantom weight of Damien Vescari's body pressing her into the concrete of the balcony, shielding her from the bullets. She smelled the unique, intoxicating blend of expensive scotch and gunpowder that clung to him. She ignored the local news. The headlines were screaming about an escalation in organized crime violence. Warehouses burning, targeted hits in the industrial district, but she refused to read the details. If she ignored it, maybe it would go away. Maybe she could go back to being just a nurse, not a witness to a mafia war. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday evening. Tessa unlocked her apartment door, her arms full of groceries she had bought just to have something to do. As she stepped inside, kicking the door shut with her heel, her foot crunched on something paper-thin. She froze. Lying on the cheap laminate floor, having been slipped under the door, was a plain white envelope. There was no name, no stamp. Tessa dropped the grocery bags. A carton of milk split open, white liquid pooling on the floor, but she didn't notice. Her trembling fingers reached for the envelope. She tore it open, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a single photograph. It was grainy and low light, clearly taken with a long-range lens. It showed Tessa walking out of the hospital entrance, her head down, looking tired. It had been taken that morning. On the back of the photo, written in a jagged, aggressive scrawl, were 3 words: "We see you." The air left the room. Damien had been right. Kostov's men knew who she was. They knew where she lived. The protection detail Damien had promised, the shadow guards she sometimes spotted parked down the street, was not enough. The enemy had gotten to her front door. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She needed to get out. She grabbed her purse, leaving the groceries rotting on the floor, and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in this apartment that had suddenly turned into a trap. She took a cab back to the hospital, the only place that felt secure, reasoning she could sleep in the on-call room. It was late, past 11, and the employee parking lot was a vast wasteland of asphalt and flickering sodium lights. Tessa paid the driver and hurried toward the staff entrance, her keys woven between her fingers, a pathetic self-defense trick she had learned in college. She heard the footsteps too late. "Hey, nurse," a rough voice rasped from the shadows between 2 parked SUVs. Tessa spun around, adrenaline spiking. A man stepped out, wearing a thick hoodie and a cruel grin. He was big, blocking her path to the door. "Victor sends his regards." The man sneered, reaching for her. Tessa screamed, swinging her bag at him, but he caught her arm easily, his grip bruising. He yanked her toward a waiting van that had idled up silently behind him. "No." "Let me go," she shrieked, digging her heels into the pavement before the man could drag her more than a few feet. The night exploded into motion. 2 car doors slammed nearby. 3 men in dark suits materialized from the darkness like avenging ghosts. There was no conversation, no warning. One of Damien's bodyguards tackled her attacker with the force of a freight train, driving him into the side of the van with a sickening crunch of metal. The scuffle was brutal, efficient, and terrifyingly fast. Tessa was shoved to the side, stumbling and falling to her knees behind a parked sedan. She covered her head, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she listened to the sounds of violence, fists hitting flesh, grunts of exertion, and the clatter of a knife skittering across the asphalt. It was over in 30 seconds. The attacker was unconscious on the ground, zip ties already being secured around his wrists by one guard, while another scanned the perimeter with a drawn weapon. "Secure the area," one of them barked. Then a sleek black car roared into the lot, disregarding all speed limits. It screeched to a halt, and before the engine died, the back door flew open. Damien Vescari stepped out. He looked like a storm cloud given human form. He strode toward his men, his coat billowing behind him, fury radiating from him in waves. How did he get this close? Damien roared at the head of his detail, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the hospital structure. "I pay you to be invisible walls, not spectators. If you ever let a hand lay on her again, I will bury you myself." The guards, men who looked like they could chew glass, looked genuinely afraid. They lowered their heads, murmuring apologies, but Damien was already turning away. His eyes scanned the lot frantically until they landed on Tessa. She was crouched behind the bumper of a Toyota, shivering violently, her arms wrapped tight around her chest. The anger drained out of Damien's face instantly, replaced by a look of sheer devastation. He moved toward her, not with the predator's stalk she had seen before, but with a desperate urgency. He dropped to his knees on the dirty pavement, disregarding his expensive suit trousers. "Tessa," he said, his voice dropping to that low, rumbling timbre that vibrated in her chest. He reached out but stopped inches from her, afraid to startle her. "Look at me." Tessa lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "He touched her?" Damien asked, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. "He grabbed my arm." She whispered, "That is all." Damien let out a breath that sounded like a curse, gently, carefully. He reached out and pried her hands away from her face. His large, warm hands enveloped hers, grounding her. He rubbed his thumbs over her knuckles, trying to transfer some of his heat to her freezing skin. "I told you they would come," he said, not with an "I told you so" arrogance, but with a heavy regret. "I tried to keep them away with guards, but it is not enough. Kostov is getting desperate." Tessa looked at the unconscious man being hauled away by the guards. She looked back at Damien. In the harsh parking lot lights, the shadows under his eyes matched hers. He looked terrifying to everyone else, but to her, he looked like the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos. "I cannot go back to my apartment," she said, her voice breaking. "They put a note under my door." Damien's eyes darkened, a flash of lethal intent crossing his features. "They were inside your building?" He squeezed her hands, pulling her focus back to him. "Tessa, listen to me. I know you hate my world. I know you think I'm a criminal and a monster, and you are right. But I am the only monster who wants to keep you alive." He leaned closer, his dark eyes searching hers. "Do you trust me? Not as a boss, not as a mafia don, but as a man. Do you trust me enough to let me keep you safe?" Tessa looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the blood on his bandage from where the stitches had likely pulled during his rush to get here. She saw the raw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "Yes," she whispered. Damien nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. "Good, then you are coming with me. Not to the safe house. I am taking you somewhere they will never find you." He helped her stand, keeping a possessive arm around her waist as he guided her to his car. This time, she didn't fight him. She leaned into his side, letting him take the weight she could no longer carry. The place Damien brought her to was not another cold, sterile fortress. It was his home. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a skyscraper in the financial district, a glass-walled sanctuary that floated above the city lights. When the private elevator doors opened, Tessa stepped into a space that was breathtakingly modern, yet surprisingly intimate. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a view of Graybridge that made the city look like a vast, glittering circuit board, but the interior contradicted the cold view. There were Persian rugs thrown over the dark hardwood floors. A grand piano sat in one corner, its lid closed, looking lonely, and everywhere there were books, stacks of them on tables, lining the built-in shelves: philosophy, history, classic literature. Some were dog-eared and worn, their spines cracked from repeated reading. It was a revelation. It revealed a depth to Damien Vascari that terrified Tessa almost as much as his gun did. It showed he was a man with a soul, which made falling for him infinitely more dangerous. "This is temporary," Damien said, closing the heavy front door and locking it with a series of distinct clicks. "Until I end this war." He showed her to the master guest suite, told her where the food was, and then retreated to his office. He gave her space, treating her like a fragile vase he was afraid of breaking. The first night, Tessa couldn't sleep. Her mind was too loud. She had forgotten to pack a bag in her flight from the apartment, so she showered and raided the closet Damien had pointed out. She found a drawer of plain black t-shirts. She pulled one on. It was massive on her, the soft cotton hitting mid-thigh, the neckline slipping off one shoulder. It smelled like him, cedar and something clean and sharp. Wrapping herself in his scent felt dangerously comforting. Thirsty. She padded barefoot out to the kitchen around 2 a.m. She poured a glass of water, leaning against the marble island, watching the rain streak against the massive windows. Unable to sleep, Tessa spun around, water sloshing over the rim of her glass. Damien was standing in the archway of the kitchen. He had discarded his jacket and tie, his dress shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, sleeves rolled up to reveal thick forearms. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand. His gaze swept over her, taking in the bare legs, the oversized shirt that belonged to him, the way her hair fell in damp waves around her face. He froze, his hand tightening around his glass. The air in the kitchen suddenly became thick, heavy with a tension that made it hard to breathe. "I didn't mean to wake you," Tessa stammered, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I just needed water. I wasn't sleeping," Damien said, his voice rougher than usual. He walked into the room, moving slowly, as if approaching a startled deer. He set his glass down on the counter, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. "You should lock the balcony doors at night," he said. "They are locked," Tessa whispered. "I know," Damien replied. He looked at her mouth, then forced his gaze back up to her eyes. It was a struggle she could clearly see. "But you should check them anyway." He was telling her to be careful. He was also telling her that seeing her like this, wearing his clothes, standing in his kitchen, was doing something to his self-control that he didn't trust. Tessa nodded, clutching her water glass like a shield. "Good night, Damien. Good night, Tessa." She fled back to her room, her heart pounding a rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with fear. Over the next week, a strange, uneasy domesticity settled over the penthouse. Tessa couldn't work. Damien had strictly forbidden it, saying the hospital was too exposed, so she channeled her anxious energy into the kitchen. She'd never been a gourmet chef, but stress made her productive. She made risottos, stews, complicated pasta dishes that required hours of chopping. Damien would come home late, his suit jacket smelling of smoke and rain, his face drawn with exhaustion. He would find her in the kitchen or on the couch. He would eat whatever she put in front of him. "This needs more salt," he would say. "Poking at a roast chicken, it is perfect. You just have ruined taste buds from smoking," she would retort, pouring him wine. He would hide a smile behind his glass, and he would eat every bite. She waited up for him every night. She told herself it was because she couldn't sleep, or because she was watching late-night movies. When he walked in at midnight, she would mute the TV and yawn theatrically. "I just fell asleep watching a documentary." She would lie. "You are a terrible liar, Tessa," he would say, loosening his tie. "But thank you." It was a dance, a careful, quiet waltz around the undeniable fact that they were becoming important to each other. Then came the night the music stopped. It was raining again, a torrential downpour that battered the glass walls. The clock read 1:30. Tessa was curled up on the expansive leather sofa, a book open on her lap, staring blindly at the page. The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and Damien stumbled out. Tessa was on her feet instantly. Damien, he was leaning heavily against the wall. His shirt was torn at the collar. His knuckles were raw and bloody, and there was a dark, purpling bruise blossoming along his jawline. His lip was split, a trickle of dried blood running down his chin. He had been in a fight, a bad one. Don't. He groaned as she rushed toward him. I am fine. Just a disagreement with some captains who thought they could leverage my distraction. Sit down, Tessa ordered, her nurse's voice cutting through his deflection. Now. She guided him to the sofa, pushing him down gently. He hissed in pain but didn't resist. He let his head fall back against the leather, closing his eyes. Tessa ran to the bathroom, grabbing the first aid kit she had located on day 1. She returned, kneeling on the floor between his spread knees. Open your eyes, she murmured, soaking a cotton pad in antiseptic. Damien opened his eyes. They were dark, dilated, burning with a mix of adrenaline and something else, something raw and hungry. Tessa reached up, her hand cupping his uninjured cheek to hold him steady. She gently dabbed at the cut on his lip. He flinched slightly, his breath hitching. Sorry, she whispered. I have to clean it. Her face was inches from his. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. She focused intently on the wound, trying to ignore the way his thigh brushed against her arm, the way his scent filled her senses. Damien watched her. He watched her lashes flutter against her cheeks. He watched the way her lips parted in concentration. He felt her gentle, firm hands caring for him, hands that should have never touched violence, now tending to the aftermath of his brutality. Tessa, he warned, his voice a low growl. Tessa paused. Her fingers were trembling slightly near his mouth. She looked up, locking eyes with him. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The electric current that had been humming between them for days suddenly spiked into a voltage that was dangerous. Damien's hand moved. He caught her wrist, stopping her ministrations. His grip was loose, giving her the option to pull away, but he didn't let go. Slowly, deliberately. He guided her hand from his lip to his jaw, pressing her palm against the rough stubble of his cheek. It was a gesture of surrender. He was leaning into her touch. Tessa didn't pull away. Her thumb brushed his cheekbone. Damien made a sound deep in his throat. He leaned in, closing the small distance between them. He kissed her. It wasn't like in the movies. It wasn't frantic or messy. It was slow, deliberate. He pressed his lips to hers with a terrifying restraint, testing the waters. When she didn't push him back, when she sighed into his mouth and tilted her head, the dam broke. The kiss deepened, becoming heavy and wet and all-consuming. Damien's hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her still as he devoured her. He tasted of copper and scotch and danger. Tessa made a whimpering sound, clutching the lapels of his ruined shirt, pulling him closer. She felt the couch frame creak as he shifted, his heavy body leaning over her, pressing her back against the cushions. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin of her throat, feeling her pulse hammer wildly beneath his touch. The heat was suffocating, a drug she wanted to overdose on. For a moment, she forgot the war, the threats, the note under the door. There was only him. Damien groaned against her mouth, his other hand sliding down to her waist, his grip tightening. He wanted to pull her underneath him. He wanted to forget that he was a monster, and she was the light he wasn't supposed to touch. But the shift in his weight, the sudden reality of his power, snapped Tessa back to the present. Panic, sharp and cold, mixed with the desire. She pulled back, breaking the kiss with a gasp. Her chest was heaving, her lips swollen and red. Wait, she breathed, her hands flat against his chest, pushing slightly. Damien stopped instantly. He didn't move away, but he froze, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged, harsh sounds in the quiet room. I can't, Tessa whispered, her voice shaking. I am scared. Damien closed his eyes. Scared of me? Scared of this, she admitted, tears pricking her eyes, scared of how much I want it, scared of what it means to want someone like you. Damien let out a long, shuddering breath. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His expression was tortured, but his hands were gentle as he smoothed her hair back from her forehead. He understood. He was dragging her into the dark, and she was terrified of the fall. I know, he murmured, his voice rough with unspent need. I know, Tessa. He didn't try to kiss her again. He didn't try to convince her. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight, crushing hug. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in. I will not push you, he promised, his voice muffled against her skin. We stop here. I will never take more than you are ready to give. Tessa wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, holding on for dear life. They stayed like that for a long time, entangled on the couch while the city lights flickered outside, two people on the edge of a cliff, stepping back from the precipice, but unable to let go of each other's hands. The fragile peace inside the penthouse was a soap bubble, shimmering and beautiful, but destined to burst at the slightest touch. For 5 days, Tessa Hale had lived in a suspended reality. She had cooked in a kitchen that cost more than her life's earnings. She had slept in a bed that felt like a cloud, and she had allowed herself to forget, for hours at a time, that there were men outside with guns waiting for her to make a mistake. But the bubble popped on a Tuesday afternoon, not with a bang, but with the rustle of paper. Tessa had been looking for a charger for her phone. She knew Damien kept a drawer of cables in his home office, a room she usually avoided. The door was cracked open, just an inch, spilling a sliver of yellow light into the hallway. She raised her hand to knock, but the sound of her own name froze her in place. We cannot ignore the brother. Marco's voice was low, urgent. Ethan Hale is a liability. Damien. If Kostov finds him before we secure him, he becomes a lever to pry Tessa open. Tessa's breath caught in her throat. Ethan. She hadn't spoken to her younger brother in 6 months, not since he had stolen her rent money to pay off a gambling debt. She loved him, but she had to love him from a distance to keep her own life afloat. I know, Damien's voice replied, deep and weary. That is why I had the file pulled. What is the debt? 20,000, Marco answered, to a loan shark in the lower district. The sharks answer to Kostov's lieutenants. It is a direct line. Boss. Tessa stepped back, her foot sinking silently into the plush hallway runner. A file. Damien had a file on her brother. A cold sense of betrayal washed over her, dousing the warmth that had been growing in her chest since the night on the couch. He wasn't just protecting her. He was investigating her. He was digging into the painful, messy secrets of her family like she was a suspect, or worse, an asset to be managed. She pushed the door open. The wood hit the stopper with a loud thud. Damien and Marco looked up instantly. They were standing around the mahogany desk, a manila folder spread open between them. Photographs of Ethan leaving a betting parlor, arguing with a man on a street corner, were scattered across the surface. Tessa walked into the room, her hands trembling, not with fear this time, but with a white-hot anger. How long? She demanded, her voice shaking. Damien straightened up. He did not look guilty. He looked resigned, like a man who had known this conversation was coming and had hoped to delay it. Tessa. He started, raising a hand. Do not Tessa me, she snapped, walking right up to the desk. She looked down at the photos of her brother, seeing the fear in Ethan's eyes captured in the grainy zoom of a surveillance lens. You had me followed. Now I find out you are stalking my family? Who gave you the right? I have to know the playing field, Damien said, his voice calm, which only infuriated her more. Marco, leave us. Marco gathered the photos quickly, shooting a wary glance at Tessa, and slipped out of the room, closing the door behind him. Now they were alone. The air in the office felt thin, charged with the static of the coming storm. You're treating my life like a mission, Tessa accused, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. You investigate my brother. You lock me in this tower. You feed me and clothe me, but you do not respect me. I am just another piece on your chessboard." Damien walked around the desk. He looked imposing, his dark shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his presence filling the room. "That is not true," he said, his tone hard. "I am trying to keep you alive. Do you think Kostov has morals? Do you think he would hesitate to grab your brother and peel him apart just to make you come out of hiding? I checked on Ethan to ensure he was safe, not to control you." "Then why didn't you ask me?" she shouted, stepping back as he approached. "Why go behind my back? Because you don't trust me. You don't know how to trust anyone. You only know how to own them." The accusation hit its mark. Damien flinched, his jaw tightening. "I do what is necessary," he growled, stepping into her space. "In my world, Tessa, trust gets you killed. Vigilance keeps you breathing. I am not in your world," Tessa yelled, shoving his chest. It was a futile gesture. He was a wall of muscle, solid and immovable. He didn't even rock back on his heels. But the physical contact seemed to snap something in both of them. Tessa shoved him again, harder this time, pouring all her fear and confusion into the motion. "I hate this. I hate that you made me part of this." Damien caught her wrists. His grip was firm, locking her hands in the air between them, but he was careful not to bruise her. He held her there, forcing her to look at him. They were standing in the doorway now, the argument having spilled out of the office and into the hall. "Stop," he commanded, his voice rough. "Let me go." Tessa struggled, twisting her wrists against his hold. Her hair had fallen into her face, and her chest was heaving with exertion. "I cannot let you go," Damien roared back, his composure finally cracking. The mask of the stoic Don shattered, revealing the desperate man beneath. "If I let you go, you die. Do you understand? I would burn this whole city to the ground before I let Kostov touch you." The raw intensity of his words hung in the air, vibrating between them. Tessa went still, her eyes wide, staring up at him. She saw the truth in his black eyes, a terrifying, consuming need to protect her that bordered on obsession. The anger was still there, boiling in her veins, but it collided with something else, adrenaline, fear, and a sharp, undeniable pull of desire that had been building for days. Damien looked at her, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes. He was breathing hard, his chest brushing against hers with every inhalation. "You make me crazy," he whispered, the admission sounding like a defeat. "You are crazy," Tessa breathed. She didn't know who moved first. One second they were arguing, and the next, the space between them vanished. Damien released her wrists, and his hand swept up to frame her face, crashing his mouth down onto hers. This was not the gentle, tentative kiss they had shared on the couch. This was a collision. It was fierce, desperate, and messy. It was a kiss born of frustration and fear, all teeth and tangled breath. Tessa made a sound in her throat, a half-sob, half-moan, and grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. They stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe of the guest bedroom. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she didn't care. Damien pressed his body against hers, pinning her to the wood. His hands were everywhere in her hair, on her waist, sliding down the curve of her spine. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was the only air left in the universe. He devoured her sighs, his tongue sweeping into her mouth, claiming her with a primitive intensity that made her knees buckle. Tessa's fingers curled into his hair, gripping tight. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her anger transmuting into passion. She wanted to feel something other than fear. She wanted to be close to the fire, even if it burned. Damien's hand slid lower, his large palm settling heavily on her hip. He tugged her upward, pressing her hips against his, and for a moment the world narrowed down to the friction of their bodies and the heat of his skin. His hand slipped under the hem of her shirt, his fingers brushing the bare skin of her waist. Tessa stiffened. It was a subtle reaction, a momentary freeze of her muscles, a gasp that got stuck in her throat. The reality of the situation, the violence, the file on her brother, the lack of control she had over her own life, crashed back in. Damien stopped instantly. He didn't pull away slowly. He went rigid. He tore his mouth from hers, his breathing ragged and harsh. He rested his forehead against the doorframe next to her head, fighting for control. His hand withdrew from under her shirt, moving back to rest safely on her waist, over the fabric. "Tessa?" he rasped, his voice wrecked. Tessa stared at his chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt flushed, dizzy, and overwhelmingly confused. She wanted him, God, she wanted him, but not like this, not when she felt like a pawn in his game. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. Damien pulled back, putting a foot of distance between them. He looked at her, searching her face for a sign that she might change her mind, but seeing only conflict and pain. "I can't decide anything," Tessa said, tears finally spilling over to track down her cheeks. "Not while I feel like a prisoner, Damien, not when I don't know where the protection ends and the control begins." The words extinguished the fire in Damien's eyes, leaving them cold and empty. He stepped back again, and the loss of his body heat made the hallway feel suddenly freezing. He ran a hand through his hair, messing up the dark strands. "You are right," he said quietly. He looked at her, and the longing in his expression was so raw it hurt to look at. "You are free to go." "Tessa?" Tessa blinked, stunned. "What? I never wanted you to feel like a captive," Damien said, his voice regaining its steely composure, though it sounded brittle. "If staying here is hurting you, then you should leave. I will have a detail watch you from a distance. You won't see them, you won't know they are there, but I cannot keep you here against your will." Tessa stood there, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. She had gotten what she demanded. She was free. So why did it feel like she was being exiled? I think that is for the best," she stammered. Damien nodded once, a sharp, final gesture. "I will have Marco drive you." He turned and walked back into his office, closing the door firmly. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silent penthouse. The extended stay hotel was on the north side of Greybridge, near the hospital but far enough from the Vescari territory to feel neutral. It was a beige, soulless room with a kitchenette that smelled of stale popcorn and industrial cleaner. Tessa unpacked her small bag, placing her few belongings in the drawers. The silence in the room was oppressive. At the penthouse, the silence had been heavy with presence, the sound of Damien pacing in his office, the faint hum of the city through the glass. Here, the silence was empty. For the next 3 days, Tessa tried to convince herself she had done the right thing. She went to work. She came home. She locked the 3 deadbolts on the flimsy hotel door. But at night, she lay awake on the lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling. She missed the smell of cedar and rain. She missed the feeling of safety she had felt when Damien was in the room. Every creak of the hotel settling made her jump. She felt exposed, a hermit crab that had lost its shell. She checked her phone constantly, hoping for a message, a check-in, anything. But Damien kept his word. He was ghosting her. He was watching. She knew. She had spotted a black sedan parked across the street twice, but he did not reach out. The war, however, did not stop just because Tessa had stepped off the board. On Friday night, Tessa sat on the edge of her bed, eating cold takeout and watching the 10 o'clock news. The anchor's face was grave. "Breaking news tonight from downtown Greybridge," the reporter said. "An explosion has rocked the Lower East Side. A homemade pipe bomb was detonated outside Joe's Bar and Grill just an hour ago." Tessa dropped her fork. Joe's. It was a dive bar she went to with the other nurses after brutal shifts. She'd mentioned it to Damien once, in passing, during one of their dinners. The screen cut to shaky footage of the scene. The front window of the bar was blown out, glass littering the street, smoke billowed into the night sky. Police suspect this is another escalation in the ongoing turf war between rival crime syndicates, the reporter continued, miraculously. No fatalities have been reported, but 7 people were injured. Tessa felt sick. Kostov wasn't just targeting Damien's business interests anymore. He was targeting places associated with her. It was a message. I can touch the things you like. I can hurt the people you know. She turned off the TV, her hands shaking. The city was becoming a battlefield, and she was the cause. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, making her jump. She grabbed it, her heart leaping into her throat. thinking, hoping it was Damien. It wasn't. The screen displayed a text from a number she didn't have saved, but she knew the area code. It was her brother's old prepaid number. Tess, I'm in trouble. Deep. They know about the debt. I can't go home. Meet me at the old shipyard warehouse on District 4. Come alone. Please, if you bring the cops or your new friends, I'm dead. Tessa stared at the screen. Her instincts screamed at her. It was too convenient. It was late. The shipyard was in the middle of nowhere. She should call Damien. She should call the number Marco had given her for emergencies. But the text said alone. If she called Damien, his men would swoop in with guns. If Ethan was being held at gunpoint, a rescue team could get him killed, or worse. If Ethan was just hiding and scared, Damien's men might hurt him, thinking he was a threat. Guilt, heavy and suffocating, settled in her chest. She had left Ethan alone for 6 months. She had been living in a penthouse while he was racking up debt. She was the big sister. It was her job to fix this. I am coming, she whispered to the empty room. She grabbed her coat and her keys. She didn't call the police. She didn't call Damien. She slipped out the back exit of the hotel to avoid the black sedan parked out front, hailing a cab 3 blocks away. The warehouse district was a graveyard of industry. Rusted cranes loomed against the night sky like skeletal fingers. The cab driver refused to go all the way down the access road, dropping her off a 1/4 mile from the pin on her map. Are you sure about this, lady? The driver asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. No, Tessa said honestly. Keep the change. She walked the rest of the way, the gravel crunching loudly under her boots. The wind howled off the river, carrying the smell of brine and rot. The warehouse marked as the meeting point was a hulking shadow with broken windows. The sliding metal door was cracked open just enough for a person to slip through. Ethan? Tessa called out, her voice echoing in the vast, dark space. She stepped inside. The warehouse was cavernous, smelling of oil and dust. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating pillars of pale light. Ethan? Are you here? There was a scuffle of movement to her right. Tessa turned, squinting into the gloom. Tess? A voice whimpered. It was Ethan. He stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates. He looked terrible. His face bruised, his clothes torn. Ethan, Tessa rushed forward, relief flooding her system. Oh my God, are you okay? She reached him, grabbing his shoulders. He was trembling. I'm sorry, Tess, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. What? Tessa asked. Confused. Why are you sorry? We have to go. We have to... She stopped. Ethan wasn't looking at her. He was looking over her shoulder. Tessa spun around. A figure emerged from the shadows behind her. It wasn't Damien. It was a man she recognized from the hospital parking lot, the one Damien's men had missed, and behind him, stepping into a pool of moonlight with a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes, was a man in a pristine gray suit. Victor Kostov. Hello, nurse, Kostov said, his voice smooth like oil on water. Tessa stumbled back, grabbing Ethan's arm to pull him with her, but Ethan didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, sobbing. He made me. Ethan choked out. He said he'd kill me. Tess, before Tessa could scream, before she could run. A shadow detached itself from the darkness to her left. She saw the flash of movement, the swing of a heavy object. Pain exploded in the back of her head. White light flared behind her eyes, followed instantly by a crushing darkness. Her knees hit the concrete first, then her shoulder. The last thing she heard before the world faded to black was Kostov's chuckle and the sound of her brother weeping. Damien, she thought. The name a silent prayer in her fading mind. Then there was nothing. The world returned in a haze of throbbing pain. Tessa Hale opened her eyes, but the darkness refused to lift completely. A sharp, rhythmic pounding echoed inside her skull, syncing perfectly with the dull ache at the base of her neck where she had been struck. She tried to reach up and touch the tender spot, but her hands refused to move. Panic, cold and immediate, flooded her system. She yanked her arms, but the coarse bite of rope dug into her wrists, binding them tightly behind the back of a metal chair. She blinked, forcing her vision to focus. She was in a warehouse. It was not the same one she had entered what felt like a lifetime ago. This one was larger, colder, smelling of rusted iron and stagnant river water. Dust motes danced in the single beam of yellow light that filtered down from a high, grime-streaked window. "Tess?" The voice was shaky, wet with tears. Tessa jerked her head up. Standing 5 feet away from her was Ethan. He was not tied up, but he looked trapped all the same. His face was a map of bruises. One eye swollen shut, his lips split. He was wringing his hands, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a nervous child waiting for a scolding. "Ethan," Tessa croaked. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. "Are you okay?" Ethan let out a sob that sounded more like a choke, and he wouldn't look at her. He stared at his sneakers. His shoulders hunched. "I'm so sorry." "Tess, I did not know they would hurt you. I swear, they just said they needed to talk to you. They said if I got you here, they would wipe the debt." Tessa stared at him, the realization hitting her harder than the blow to her head had, the text message, the urgency. It hadn't just been a trap set by Kostov. It had been a trap baited by her own brother. "You sold me out," she whispered, the betrayal cutting deep into her chest. "For money? $20,000. "Tess," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I owed $20,000 to the sharks. They were going to break my legs. They were going to kill me. Kostov said all I had to do was send the text. He said no one would get hurt. He lied." "Ethan," Tessa yelled back, struggling against her bonds. "Look around you. Do you think this ends well?" Before Ethan could answer, the screech of a heavy metal door sliding open echoed through the vast space. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, echoing on the concrete floor. Viktor Kostov stepped into the pool of light. He looked immaculate in a charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the filth of the warehouse. He held a lit cigarette in one hand, the smoke curling up around his cold, dead eyes. "Family reunions are always so touching," Kostov said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth. He stopped beside Ethan, resting a hand on her brother's shoulder. Ethan flinched violently but didn't pull away. "You," Kostov said to Ethan, "go stand over there. You are cluttering my view." Ethan scrambled away, retreating into the shadows near a stack of rotting pallets. Kostov turned his attention to Tessa. He walked around her chair slowly, inspecting her like a piece of livestock he had just purchased. He took a drag of his cigarette and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. "You are prettier than the photos," he mused. "I can see why Damien Vascari broke his own rules for you. It's quite romantic. Really. The big bad wolf and the nurse who saved him. It would make a lovely movie." "Where is he?" Tessa demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Oh, he is coming," Kostov said with a cruel smile. "He just does not know it yet. You see, my dear, you are not the target. You are simply the invitation." He leaned in close, bringing his face inches from hers. She could smell the expensive tobacco and the mint on his breath. "Damien has been a thorn in my side for too long. He thinks he can control this city with honor, with rules. But rules are just chains you put on yourself. I am going to show him what happens when you care about something more than the mission." He pulled a phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. "I just sent him a picture of you," Kostov said casually. "Bound, unconscious, very dramatic. The message was simple. Come alone, or the girl and her useless brother die." Tessa's heart stopped. "He will know it is a trap. Of course he will know." Kostov laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "But he will come anyway. That is the problem with heroes. Tessa, they are predictable. And when he walks through those doors, I am going to kill him in front of you, across the city, inside the glass-walled fortress of the Vascari penthouse." The air was vibrating with a rage so potent it felt physical. Damien Vascari stood in the center of his office. His phone lay on the mahogany desk, the screen displaying the image that had shattered his world 3 minutes ago. Tessa, head lolling to the side, tied to a chair in the dark. A roar tore from his throat, a primal sound of fury that made the glass decanters on the sidebar rattle. He swept his arm across the desk, sending a lamp, a stack of files, and a heavy crystal ashtray crashing to the floor. Marco burst into the room, gun already drawn, expecting an attack. "Boss?" Marco gasped, seeing the destruction. "They have her," Damien snarled. He turned to face his lieutenant, his eyes burning with a violence that made Marco take a step back. Kostov has her. Damien walked to the window, staring out at the city he had sworn to protect, the city that was now hiding the woman he loved. His mind raced, fighting through the red haze of anger to find the cold, hard logic he needed to save her. She was at a hotel. She was safe. The detail was watching. How did she get out without them seeing? How did Kostov know exactly when to grab her? It wasn't just surveillance. It was inside information. Find Luca, Damien ordered, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register. Luca? Marco frowned. He's overseeing the shipment at the docks. Why? Because only 3 people knew where Tessa was staying, Damien said, turning back to Marco. Me, you, and the man who organized the security detail, Rhoda. Bring him to me. Now. 20 minutes later, the door to the penthouse opened again. 2 guards dragged a struggling man into the room. Luca, a captain who had served the Vescari family for 10 years, looked pale and sweaty. Damien didn't yell. He didn't pace. He stood perfectly still in the center of the room, rolling up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. Leave us, Damien commanded the guards. Marco, stay. The guards left. Luca stood up, straightening his jacket, trying to muster a look of indignation. Damien, what is this? You drag me here like a criminal. I have been loyal to... Damien moved. He crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion. His fist connected with Luca's stomach, doubling the man over. Before Luca could wheeze for breath, Damien grabbed him by the throat and slammed him back against the wall. Where is she? Damien asked. I do not know what you are talking about, Luca choked out, clawing at Damien's hand. Damien tightened his grip. Do not lie to me, Luca. You sold the patrol routes to Kostov. You told him when the shift change happened at the hotel. That is the only way she could have slipped out unseen. How much did he pay you? Luca's face was turning purple. He looked into Damien's eyes and saw no mercy, only a promise of violence. He promised me the North District, Luca gasped. He said you were weak. He said you were going soft over a girl. Damien threw him to the floor. Luca scrambled backward, coughing, holding his throat. I am not soft, Damien said, looking down at the traitor with disgust. I am focused. He pulled a gun from the holster at the small of his back. He racked the slide. Luca screamed, throwing his hands up. Please, Damien, we go back 10 years. You sold her, Damien said, his voice void of emotion. You sold an innocent woman to a butcher because you wanted a promotion. Damien aimed the gun. He didn't shoot to kill. He fired once into Luca's right kneecap. The scream that tore through the penthouse was curbed by the soundproof walls. Luca writhed on the floor, clutching his shattered leg. Damien holstered the weapon. He turned to Marco, who was watching with a grim expression. Lock him in the cellar. Do not let him die. When I bring her back, he will answer for everything. If I do not come back, do what needs to be done. Damien walked to his desk, stepping over the man who had betrayed him. He picked up his phone and looked at the picture of Tessa one last time. Get the tactical team, he told Marco. We are going to the shipyard. It is a trap. Boss, Marco said urgently. You know it is a trap. He wants you to walk in there so he can kill you. I know, Damien said, grabbing a fresh jacket. He checked the magazine of his spare pistol and tucked it into his waistband. I am going to walk through the front door, Damien said, his eyes cold and sharp. I will buy you time. Take the team around the back. Come in through the roof vents. Do not engage until I give the signal. What is the signal? Marco asked. When the lights go out, Damien said. The drive to the warehouse district was a blur of streetlights and rain. Damien drove alone, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He forced his breathing to slow, forced his heart rate to drop. He needed to be ice. He needed to be the monster everyone feared, not the man who was terrified of losing the only good thing in his life. He parked the car in plain sight of the warehouse doors. He stepped out into the rain, raising his hands to show he was unarmed, though the backup piece was tucked against the small of his back, hidden by the line of his jacket. He walked toward the open metal doors. Every step was a battle against the instinct to run in screaming her name. He entered the warehouse. The space was cavernous, shadows stretching like long fingers across the concrete. In the center, under a single light, he saw her, Tessa. She was slumped in the chair, her hair messy, a bruise forming on her temple. But her head snapped up when he entered. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, not for herself, he realized with a pang of agony, but for him. "Damien," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Go back. It is a trap." Damien didn't stop. He walked until he was 10 yards away, then stopped. Victor Kostov stepped out from the shadows behind Tessa's chair. He held a heavy pistol, the barrel resting casually against Tessa's shoulder. 2 other gunmen flanked him, weapons raised. Ethan was cowering in the corner, sobbing quietly. "You came," Kostov said, sounding delighted. "I told her you would. Let them go." "Victor," Damien said. His voice was steady, projecting power he didn't feel. "This is between you and me. The girl is a civilian, the boy is a nobody. Let them walk out, and you get me." Tessa struggled against the ropes. "No, Damien, do not do it. He is going to kill you anyway." Damien's eyes flicked to hers for a second. In that brief glance, he poured everything he couldn't say. "I love you. I am sorry." "Hold on," Kostov laughed. "You are in no position to negotiate. Damien, you are unarmed. You are outnumbered, and I have the prize." He reached down and grabbed a handful of Tessa's hair. Yanking her head back, Tessa cried out, a sharp sound of pain that made Damien's vision blur with red. "Stop!" Damien growled, taking a step forward. Ah, Kostov tutted, pressing the gun barrel against Tessa's neck. "Stay right there. I want to savor this." He looked over at Ethan. "Bring the boy here." Kostov ordered his men. One of the guards grabbed Ethan and dragged him into the light. Ethan was dead weight, his legs refusing to work. They threw him to the ground at Damien's feet. "Please!" Ethan wept, clutching at Damien's shoe. "Please, I didn't mean to." Damien looked down at the boy who had sold his sister. He wanted to kick him. He wanted to crush him. But he looked at Tessa, and he saw the desperate plea in her eyes. "Save him." "He is a child," Damien said to Kostov. "Let him go." Kostov smirked. "He needs to learn a lesson about debts. Teach him." The guard standing over Ethan raised his rifle butt and brought it down hard on Ethan's ribs. Ethan screamed, a horrific, high-pitched sound that echoed off the metal walls. "No!" Tessa shrieked, thrashing in the chair so hard it nearly tipped over. "Stop it! Please stop it!" Damien flinched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to attack. But he knew Marco and the team needed 2 more minutes. He had to stall. "Is this what you have become?" "Victor?" Damien asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "Beating children, torturing women? You wanted the city? You are not a king. You are a thug." Kostov's smile vanished. "I am the man who won." He spat. He signaled the guard again. The man kicked Ethan in the stomach, hard. Ethan curled into a ball, retching. Damien took another step forward, unable to help himself. "I said stop." Kostov turned the gun. He pressed the muzzle hard against Tessa's temple, pushing her head to the side. "Take another step, and I paint the wall with her," Kostov hissed. The world froze. Damien froze. He looked at Tessa. She was weeping silent tears. Her blue eyes locked on his. There was so much fear there, but also so much love. She was mouthing something to him. Run. She wanted him to run. She was willing to die to save him. The realization broke him. "Okay," Damien said, holding up his hands. "Okay, Victor, you win." He slowly lowered himself to his knees. The concrete was cold and wet against his trousers. He looked up at Kostov, surrendering his height, his power, his pride. "Take me," Damien said softly. "Let them go. Let them walk out the door, and I will stay. You can do whatever you want to me. Just let her go." Tessa sobbed, shaking her head. "No, Damien, no, please." Kostov looked at Damien kneeling in the dirt. A look of triumph washed over his face. He had done it. He had brought the great Damien Vascari to his knees. He took the gun away from Tessa's head. He aimed it squarely at Damien's chest. "I think I will just kill you all," Kostov said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It is cleaner that way. Goodbye, Damien." Damien didn't look at the gun. He looked at Tessa. Now. A loud thunk sounded from the main breaker box on the far wall. The warehouse plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. For a split second, there was silence. Then, the world exploded. Glass shattered from the skylights above as ropes dropped from the rafters. The distinct, suppressed thwip-thwip of silencers cut through the air. Damien moved before the first casing hit the floor. He didn't run away. He lunged forward into the dark, guided by memory and desperation. Diving toward the spot where Tessa was tied, Kostov fired blindly. The muzzle flash lit up the room like a strobe light, a single, terrifying frame of violence. Bang! A bullet chipped the concrete inches from Damien's ear. Bang! Damien crashed into the chair, tackling Tessa, knocking her and the chair sideways to the floor just as another shot tore through the space where her chest had been. "Get down!" he roared, covering her body with his own in the dark. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Damien's men were in the rafters. Kostov's men were spraying bullets wildly. The air filled with the deafening roar of automatic weapons and the screams of men dying. Damien fumbled in the dark, his hands finding the ropes at Tessa's wrists. He ripped at a pocket knife he had concealed in his sleeve. "Stay down," he screamed over the noise. Tessa was screaming his name, but he couldn't hear her. He slashed the ropes. Another muzzle flash illuminated the room. Kostov was standing 10 feet away, firing at them, his face twisted in a mask of demonic rage. Damien felt a sledgehammer blow to his left arm, a graze, a hit. He didn't know. He just knew he had to get her out. Chaos reigned. The darkness was alive with death. And in the center of the storm, Damien held Tessa tight, neither of them knowing if they would live to see the lights come back on. The warehouse had become a strobe-lit nightmare of noise and violence. Muzzle flashes cut through the pitch blackness like lightning strikes, illuminating brief, terrifying vignettes of men shouting and bodies falling. The roar of automatic gunfire was deafening, bouncing off the corrugated metal walls until the sound felt like a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. Tessa Hale was on the floor. When Damien had tackled her, the force of the impact had tipped her metal chair sideways. She had crashed hard against the concrete, her shoulder taking the brunt of the blow, but the chaos was her cover. She dragged in a breath that tasted of dust and cordite. Her wrists were still bound tight behind her, the rope biting into her skin, but her hands scrabbled frantically against the rough floor. Her fingers brushed against something sharp, a jagged piece of rusted metal strapping that had snapped off a shipping crate during the initial volley of gunfire. She didn't hesitate. She rolled onto her side, ignoring the bruising ache in her ribs, and sawed the ropes against the jagged edge. It was clumsy, desperate work. The metal scraped her skin, drawing blood, but she didn't stop. She pulled and twisted, her terror fueling her strength, until the fibers finally gave way with a sudden snap. Her hands were free. Tessa scrambled to her knees, keeping her head low as bullets chewed up the wooden crate above her. She crawled through the dirt and debris, her eyes stinging from the smoke. "Ethan!" she screamed, though her voice was lost in the cacophony. She found him curled in a ball near the pallets, his hands zip-tied, his face buried in the dirt. He was paralyzed with fear, sobbing uncontrollably. Tessa grabbed his collar and shook him hard. "Ethan, move!" She pulled the pocket knife Damien had dropped in the scuffle. She had spotted it glinting in a flash of gunfire and sliced through her brother's restraints. "Go!" she shouted, shoving him toward the shadowy outline of a service door on the far wall. "The police are coming! Get out! Run until you cannot run anymore!" Ethan stumbled to his feet, looking at her with wild, terrified eyes. "Come with me!" "No!" Tessa yelled, pushing him away. "I'm not leaving him!" Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, looked at the chaotic firefight erupting in the center of the room, and then turned and bolted into the darkness. Tessa turned back toward the hellscape. She should have followed him. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to flee, but then she saw Damien. He was 20 feet away, pinned behind a heavy industrial forklift. He was unarmed, having lost his gun in the initial tackle. 3 of Kostov's men were laying down suppressive fire, keeping Damien's team trapped in the rafters, while Viktor Kostov himself stalked toward Damien's position like a wolf cornering a wounded deer. Damien looked exhausted. Blood was dark on the shoulder of his white shirt where a bullet had grazed him. He was breathing hard, his eyes darting around for a weapon, but there was nothing within reach. Kostov stepped around the forklift, raising his pistol with a sadistic grin. "Game over, Damien!" Kostov shouted over the din. Tessa did not think. She did not plan. She simply reacted. She saw a length of heavy iron pipe lying in the rubble near her feet. She grabbed it. It was heavy, cold and rusted, weighing her down, but adrenaline made it feel like balsa wood. As Kostov raised his gun, leveling it at Damien's chest, Tessa sprinted out of the shadows. She didn't scream. She didn't announce her presence. She swung the pipe with every ounce of strength she possessed. The iron connected with Kostov's forearm with a sickening crunch of bone. Kostov howled, his shot going wide. The bullet sparked against the concrete floor, ricocheting up to tear a shallow gash across Damien's upper arm instead of piercing his heart. Kostov spun around, his face a mask of shock and pain, the gun clattering from his numb fingers. "You little—" Kostov snarled, backhanding Tessa across the face before she could swing again. The blow sent her sprawling to the ground, the pipe skittering away, but she had bought Damien the second he needed. Damien launched himself from behind the forklift. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a force of nature. He collided with Kostov, driving him back into a stack of oil drums. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and fury. It was a brutal, ugly fight. There was no martial arts finesse, only the raw, desperate struggle for survival. Kostov, desperate and injured, clawed at Damien's eyes while Damien pounded his fist into Kostov's ribs, his face a mask of cold, lethal determination. Tessa shook her head, clearing the dizziness from the slap. She saw Kostov's gun lying on the concrete 3 feet away. She crawled toward it, her hand closed around the cold steel grip. It was heavier than she expected. She scrambled to her knees and raised the weapon with both hands. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the noise. Damien froze, his fist raised. Kostov, bloodied and gasping, looked up. Tessa stood there, trembling from head to toe. She held the gun pointed squarely at Kostov's chest. Her finger hovered over the trigger. She had spent her entire life saving people, stitching them back together. The idea of taking a life, of pulling that trigger, made bile rise in her throat. "Shoot him!" Damien roared, his voice ragged. "Tessa, end it." Tessa looked at Kostov. She saw the fear in his eyes. She saw a broken, pathetic man who dealt in death but was terrified of receiving it. I can't," she whispered, the tears spilling over, but she didn't lower the gun. She held it steady, her blue eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. She wouldn't kill him, but she wouldn't let him move either. That hesitation was enough. Kostov, seeing her waver, reached for a knife in his boot. Damien didn't wait. He used the distraction Tessa provided. He grabbed Kostov's wrist, twisted it with a sickening snap, and delivered a final, concussive blow to Kostov's temple. Viktor Kostov slumped to the floor, unconscious. The warehouse suddenly seemed to go quiet. The gunfire from the rafters had stopped. Sirens were wailing outside, loud, piercing, and getting closer by the second. Damien stood up slowly. He was swaying on his feet, his shirt in tatters, covered in dust and blood. He looked at the unconscious man at his feet. Then he looked at Tessa. Tessa lowered the gun, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Damien walked toward her. He didn't run. He walked with a steady, heavy gait. He stopped in front of her and gently took the gun from her hands, setting it on a crate. "You did good," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel. He reached out, his hand cupping her bruised cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. "Go," Tessa said, her voice trembling. "The police are here. You have to go." Damien looked at the door. His men were already rappelling down, signaling for him to move. "We leave him," Damien said, looking down at Kostov. "He is the gift. The police will find him here with the weapons, the drugs, the evidence. It ends tonight." He looked back at Tessa. The air between them was thick with unsaid things. He wanted to take her with him. He wanted to drag her back to the penthouse and lock the world out, but he knew he couldn't. Not tonight. "Go to the police," he instructed, his eyes intense. Tell them you were kidnapped. Tell them you escaped. Do not mention me." He leaned in and pressed a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead. "I will find you," he promised. Then he turned and vanished into the shadows with his men, leaving Tessa standing alone in the center of the warehouse as the blue and red lights of the police cruisers began to wash over the walls. 6 weeks later, the rain in Graybridge was soft, a gentle drizzle rather than a storm. Tessa sat in her new apartment on the west side of the city. It was small, a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors and a radiator that clanked, but it was hers, and it was safe. She was back at the hospital, working the day shift now. The dark circles under her eyes had faded, though she still startled when a car backfired. On the coffee table in front of her sat a thick manila envelope. It had arrived 3 days ago by courier. Inside were papers for Ethan, a new identity, a job placement in a rehabilitation center 3 states away, and a clean financial slate. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Only one man had the power to make an entire life disappear and reappear somewhere safer. Ethan was gone, safe and starting over. Kostov was in federal custody, his empire dismantled by the evidence found in the warehouse. The news called it a lucky break for the police. Tessa knew better. A knock sounded at her door. Tessa froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. She stood up, walking slowly to the door. She checked the peephole. Her breath hitched. She unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. Damien stood in the hallway. He looked different. The expensive Italian suits were gone, replaced by dark jeans and a black leather jacket that looked worn. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, but the heavy, crushing weight she had always sensed on him seemed lighter. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Tessa stepped back, opening the door wide. Damien walked in, bringing the scent of rain and cool air with him. He looked around the small apartment, the thrift store couch, the potted plant on the windowsill, the cozy clutter of a normal life. "It is small," he observed, a small smile playing on his lips. "It is home," Tessa said, hugging her arms around herself. Damien turned to face her. He didn't step closer, respecting the distance she had put between them. "I stepped down," he said abruptly. Tessa blinked. "What?" "The family, the business. I stepped down. Marco is running the day-to-day operations now. I kept the legitimate holdings, the shipping, the real estate. But the rest, the violence, the territory wars, I am done." He took a step toward her, his dark eyes searching her face for a reaction. "I cannot promise you that I am clean, Tessa. My hands will never be fully clean. I have a past that will always cast a shadow. But I am trying. I am trying to build a life that does not involve bulletproof glass." "Why?" Tessa whispered, her heart pounding. "Because I realized that I was terrified," Damien admitted. His voice dropped, raw and honest. "In that warehouse, when I saw the gun at your head, I wasn't scared of dying. I was scared of living in a world without you in it." He took another step, closing the distance. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist, asking for permission. "I am scared of this," he whispered. "I am terrified of grocery lists and shared toothbrush cups and watching movies on a Tuesday night. I am scared that I do not know how to be a normal man, but I want to try. If you will let me." Tessa looked at him. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the same look he had given her in the alleyway, the night she saved his life. He was stripping himself bare for her. She didn't speak. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Damien let out a shuddering breath and pulled her against him. His arms went around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor as he buried his face in her hair. "I missed you," she sobbed into his jacket. "I missed you every second." He murmured against her neck. He pulled back and kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss of survival this time. It was a promise. It was slow and deep, filled with all the longing and fear they had carried for weeks. He walked her backward, not breaking the kiss, until her legs bumped against the edge of her bed. It was a narrow, twin-sized frame she had bought cheap. They tumbled onto it together. The mattress groaned loudly under Damien's weight, the springs squeaking in protest as his large frame nearly eclipsed the entire bed. Tessa laughed. It was a breathless, happy sound that broke the tension. She looked up at him, her face flushed, her hair spread out on the pillow. "You are too big for this bed," she whispered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. Damien chuckled. The sound was low and warm, vibrating against her chest. He braced his weight on his elbows to keep from crushing her, his hands resting respectfully at her waist. "Then we will break it together," he murmured. He lowered his head, kissing the hollow of her throat. Tessa gasped, her hands sliding under his jacket to feel the warmth of his shirt, the solid muscle of his back. Their kissing grew deeper, more desperate. Hands roamed, exploring with a reverence that was almost holy. He traced the line of her spine. She splayed her hand over his racing heart. They paused often, pulling back just an inch to search each other's faces, needing the reassurance that this was real, that they were safe, that they were choosing this. "You are okay?" he whispered, his eyes dark with emotion. "I am perfect," she breathed. The camera of the mind lingered on them there, the way their bodies fit together on the too small mattress, the soft gasps of affection, the tangled limbs. The darkness of the room seemed to wrap around them not as a threat, but as a blanket, protecting the fragile, beautiful thing they were building. The scene faded gently to black, leaving them wrapped in each other's arms, finally surrendering to the life and love they had fought so hard to keep. Epilogue. Sunlight filtered through the cheap, sheer curtains, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Dust motes danced in the light, peaceful and slow. The small apartment was quiet. Clothes were scattered on the floor, a leather jacket on top of a nurse's cardigan. A crooked picture frame on the dresser showed a photo of Tessa and Ethan from years ago, smiling. The bed was messy, the sheets tangled, in the kitchen. The smell of burnt toast hung in the air. Tessa sat at the small, wobbly table, wearing Damien's shirt again. She was laughing, holding a mug of coffee with both hands. Damien stood by the stove, scraping the black char off a piece of toast with a butter knife. He looked ridiculously out of place in the tiny kitchen, yet perfectly at home. He turned, handing her the salvaged toast with a sheepish grin. "I think I need practice," he said. Tessa took a bite and smiled. "It is the best toast I have ever had." She looked past him, toward the dresser in the bedroom. The bottom drawer was slightly open. Inside, locked away in a safe box rather than sitting on the nightstand, was his gun. It was there, a part of who he was, but it was put away. Damien sat down opposite her, taking her hand across the table. His thumb rubbed over her knuckles, a habit he hadn't lost. The bed squeaked as he shifted his weight on the chair. "We definitely need a new bed," he noted dryly. Tessa laughed, intertwining her fingers with his. "We have time," she said softly. "We have all the time in the world." Damien smiled, lifting her hand to kiss her palm, the bond between them, forged in fear, tempered in fire, and held together by fragile hope, felt stronger than steel. And for the first time in 100 years, the morning felt like a beginning, not just another day of survival. Thank you so much for reading this story. It has been a journey through the rain-soaked streets of Graybridge, from that first desperate night in the alley to the quiet, sunlit morning of a new life. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are reading from in the world. Did you think Damien would actually leave the life for Tessa? If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to Mafia Romance Stories for more tales of danger, passion, and redemption. Share your thoughts in English in the comments section. I read every single one. Thank you for being part of this story.